Hi friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com, and I'm responding to a video I saw from Musings by Masha, where she has, a challenge, I guess, where you answer, 10 questions. What are your favorite, this, that, or this other in tarot? And after I saw her video and I went to copy down my responses to her questions, I realized that it was originally a video response to Justin Michael. So I'm going to be watching his for sure as well, and I'll include his link down below along with Masha's link. Now, the reason you're looking at me, because today's not a particularly good hair day or makeup day or any other thing day, but because I have so many decks on my table, there's no room. So I don't know how I'm going to facilitate this video, but I'll do my very best because I do have some interesting, decks to share in response to Justin's prompts. Now, the first question is, what is the first historic romance I ever had? But, I'll interpret that to be like, what was the first, tarot deck, that I ever had. And for those of you who follow me, you know that it was the 1JJ Swiss. Now, I don't really know if this is a historic deck per se. It wasn't created until 1833. It was available in the United States in the late 60s, So I don't know if this is considered a historic deck, but in a way it is. It's a Besançon, so it's kind of like a historic deck in those days. Now, you go back far enough. I don't have the luxury of having been born in the 1990s, where tarot is much more common than it used to be. And in those days, for a person like myself who responded mostly to the non-scenic pips like I did, that's where I kind of like fixated. There were not too many options in the 70s when I started reading. And, most of the bookstores by the 1990s were flooding the market in the United States, at least, with Waite Coleman Smith. So I had to grab pip style cards when I could get my hands on them. One of them was the Classic Tarot, one of the first, besides the 1JJ Swiss, was this. I think I probably got my hands on it in the, mid 70s. I just love this deck. It's a favorite for sure. And then the Spanish Tarot. Now, this one is a replacement. I had this years ago in I guess, a older edition, but I moved across the country a few times and stuff happens, right? So I had to replace it. And of course, I had a Fournier deck. And then as far as like the first like historic deck, but that wasn't maybe as ordinary. Not that those decks are very ordinary, but I remember in the early, or maybe I don't know when it was, but it was probably in late 70s or maybe early 80s. I went to a New York museum. It might have been the Cloisters. Gosh, I can't remember which museum it was because I would have done a lot of museums. But I saw some cards that turned out, I believe, to have been from the Visconti Sorsa deck. And once I saw those cards, it alerted me that these cards were really, really old. And I had to have them. But it wasn't until the 90s that Lo Scarabeo, at least, made any kind of deck honoring the Visconti Sorsas. Now, of course, it's in one of their, smaller decks, and it's got, the 35 languages on it and everything, but it was probably the first time, it was for me, the very first time that the Visconti Sorsa deck was made available. And I guess maybe this would have been considered the very first real historic deck that I owned, or the earliest historic deck. Another deck that I got my hands on was the Oswald Worth, but they have since made, many truer versions of this deck. And, I don't think this deck is seen to be very, very authentic to the way he created the cards. But bear in mind, at the time, pickings were slim as far as getting one's hands on non-scenic pip tarot decks, right? So I would gravitate. So all the cards that I've mentioned were probably the first historic tarot decks that I've ever owned. The most recent acquisition is the Peterson, if I can find where it is. Oh my goodness. The Peterson VV. I've only had this about a week. I have since ordered 2 other decks, so 2 other decks are on the way, but this is the most recent that I actually arrived. And I did a video on the VV, the Peterson VV, just a couple videos ago. So if you haven't caught it and you'd like to catch it, it's a great deck. It's a beautiful deck. Okay, question 3. Favorite contemporary, historically based tarot. Now, you guys know I love my artisan tarot decks, right? So I want to mention their names here. But I took this question to mean, somebody who's come and created. Oh, you just see in my neck. Just thinking about that. I actually have a body. But I actually interpreted this question as creating a new tarot deck that's based on old, historic patterns or symbolism. And so for that, I'm picking the Rare Triumphs by Ian Cumsey. I hope I'm saying his name right. I'm not wearing my glasses, which is always a mistake. Ian Cumsey. And I really like this deck. For one, I like its size. When I travel or when I throw a bag in my purse, I like smaller decks, because they're they don't weigh 3,000 pounds, and they're no fuss, no muss. Ian Cumsey has done the, Pike and Clover cards. He's done others, right? And I want to point out that there are, I believe, 3 options that he provides. I believe this one would be for an alternative to the Fool card. We have somebody who's in ruins, but he has his music. He's inspired nonetheless, right? Another for the Magician card. Because there are different traditions of how certain cards are portrayed, right? And sometimes the card that we call the Magician card, La Batellura Il Gatto, was represented as a worker. We see that in the Perrin Tarot. We see it, I think, in the Soprafino, right? Where they're craftsmen or artisans. So he offers an alternative for that one as a worker. And then I believe this one was probably for the Judgment card at the end. It's called the Player. But I chose the other alternates for those cards for the Fool, rather than choosing, and I can change my mind at any time, the young man with the I'm not sure what kind of instrument this is. Maybe it's a lute, but I don't know. I chose rather the more traditional TDM, and I chose it because I like that it has a face on it. Now, it probably, in the day, was probably the face of the Fool, in reference to the Fool in the mirror, and I did a little video about 7 minutes long, maybe 2 videos ago. So if you want to catch that, that's pretty interesting. But here Ian Cumsey chose to portray it as a horse and called it the Wanderer. And rather than using the card designated as the worker for the number 1 card, I chose the Trickster. Now there is tradition of, representing or, interpreting the number one card depending on the scene. He's either a worker or a trickster, right? So I kind of like when he's represented as a trickster. And so I chose that card. And then we have, the teacher instead of the female pope, which a lot of people have replaced with Juno and Jupiter, rather than the empress. We have a merchant. The nobleman rather than the emperor. And the president instead of the high priest today, or the pope. But then we have the usual love. He calls it Chariot Victory. So he has put new spin, on a traditional deck. And so for that reason, and that's how I interpret it, the question, which is your favorite tarot, contemporary historically based tarot. And I love that he calls this time, and I love that the hermit has an hourglass and a walking stick, because as I've mentioned in many videos, the walking stick would have been used to tell the time during the day, right? And the hourglass would have been used to tell the time during the night. And we have the cave. So everything about this card for me is right. I love this card. So, and it's a mass-produced deck. I mean, I don't have any, this isn't a fancy, one-of-a-kind kind of deck. I don't know if it's out of print or anything, but I do know that if it's available, you should probably check it out. The Devil card is reconceived as chaos, which is probably a nod to the occultists. But then we have, the Thunderbolt, which is, a nod to another tradition for the Tower. And here's the alternate to the Judgment card, which I prefer, this one. And I love this World card. I loathe the World card where there's the central figure surrounded by wreaths and the four evangelists. I don't like it. I know it's the best card in the deck and everything, but boy, I love me a World card that doesn't look like that. So, and then of course, it's got the French flair where the suits of the pips are, like such. Oh, let's see if I can get some of the coins. Yeah, they're tiles. So I love this deck. And I just wanted to point it out. I apologize that it's going to take me a little bit of time to take the time to put them together. But I just don't want to slap my cards and then have to deal with it later because, oh my God. Okay, the next question is my favorite deck by Yves Renaud, Tarot of Marseille Heritage Group. And I took out the Gassman for that. Now I have many of Yves Renaud's decks. I don't know that I have all of them, but I have close. There's only a few I don't have. So I can speak with some authority on that. But this is my favorite of his decks, and it was produced in the canton of Geneva, one of the 26 cantons forming the Swiss Confederation. If we look at the map, we will see here is, it's hard for me to see backwards. Where's Switzerland? I think, is this Switzerland? Right here, okay. So here we have Switzerland, and we see that Geneva's right here. You know, it's just about as much in France as you can get without being France, right? So this is where this deck was created. So it's Swiss with French influence. And of course, if we look again at the map, we can't help but notice that, you know, how France and Switzerland were right there in northern Italy, right? Now, despite it having a Swiss flavor, and it reminds me a lot of the Burdell, which I also like a lot. You know, you see it in the batons, I think. But it's not a Besançon, despite being Swiss. I like it because now they're nice bright colors. Now I do have more of a facsimile copy of this put out by the folks at Deviant Moon, Patrick Valenza, which is, I like having, you know, my facsimile decks, but I like this one better because it's, I think, just a lot. It takes advantage of how wonderful the images are, and the colors are so nice. I love it. I'm so happy. And then I love the Ace of Cups, which they usually I can spot when it's a Swiss deck just by looking at the Ace of Cups. And the batons. And then the Hanged Man. There's clues in the Hanged Man. Let's see if I can find the Ace of Cups. I mean, here's the moon. Of course, I'm not finding the Ace of Cups when I want to find it. Let me pause. Here's the Ace of Cups. So I like the Ace of Cups. But anyway, it's a fun deck. And I think I mentioned that I believe that the classic tarot put out by US Game Systems Inc. in the 70s was probably based on this deck. Okay, next question is number 5. My favorite from Sullivan Tarot Sheet Revival. And I have, I believe, everything that was produced, Sullivan Hissman's produced there. I mean, maybe he has some, you know, handmade options or something that I didn't buy, but I have the Rosenwald, I have the Budapest, and then I have the Adam C. Hatot deck. And I think this one is my favorite of theirs. Now, I took it out of the packaging. All of Sullivan Hissman's decks have, you know, wrapping that are more or less authentic to the period of time, and, you know, very elaborate, you know, but they're kind of like inconvenient, you know, so it's kind of a chore to get in and out of those decks. But I love the color. Oh, and I love the border. I just love the border. And of course, it's another, you know, I'm wondering if there's a little pattern here that I seem to like, the Swiss influence, right? So we have, or Belgium influence. We have the captain and I, in place of the female pope. But the colors are so great. And then, you know, in some of the cards, I should have pulled a couple that I like a lot. Let me pull a few. I mean, how do you not love this little guy? You know, this little parrot type animal, type bird, you know, inside the Two of Swords. How do you not love that? And of course, it has the Bacchus in place of the Pope. We have the early Italian influence of a jester face on the satchel, which I've spoken about, as I mentioned in another video, like a day or two ago. Here we have kind of like the Swiss Ace of Cups. We have the world that I love, that style of world. And then we have an interesting hanged man who's inverted. Or maybe not, depending on your perspective. But I love this deck. So I think this deck is my favorite of the Tarot Sheet Revival bunch. I'm not going to take the time to put this one away because it'll take me all day. Okay, my favorite from Giordano Berti. And now I don't have as many of his as I have of Yves Renault. Maybe I have 5 or 6 from Giordano Berti. And they're all exquisite. I mean, the Vernano for a long time was my favorite. And the Perrin, I have a soft spot for the Perrin. And I'll show you those a little bit later. But I think of the ones that I have from Giordano Berti, I think I like the Miller. Again, I think it's Swiss. I love this deck. It's a Tarocchi Besançon 1780. And I love it because, oh my gosh, it's just so juicy. Just such a juicy deck. I mean, look at those colors. We have Juno instead of the female Pope. And of course, Jupiter in place of the Pope. And it's interesting. I mean, they're really reasonable substitutes, when we have the eagle, which is associated with Jupiter, as he is associated with the Emperor. And Juno sounds an awful lot like Juno, right? Who may have been the inspiration for the female Pope. But anyway, I just love it. It's just so juicy. Oh my gosh. And the card stock is real nice. I love it. I love the stock, and I love it. The Hermit has, an Asian flair, like he's from another place, maybe. That's the look I get, the feel I get. So I like this deck. Oh, look at the moon. Look at the moon. Isn't that great? Okay. Okay, the next. My favorite deck by Il Minigela. Now, I have several from Il Minigela. I think it's like this. If the Tarocca Visconti Brambilla had all the cards, and I understand that they don't exist, so how do you, and enough don't exist that it would be, I guess, virtually impossible to do a real, reasonable deck with what was left. I think there's only like one. I think there's only like one triumph card or one trump card, and maybe a couple court cards, But the quality of the images and the cards are so incredibly beautiful that if they had put this kind of quality in the Visconti Sorsa tarot that they have, which they use a different paper stock and I guess a different method for photographing. But if they had put this kind of quality into that deck, it would definitely be my favorite, because this this deck is just exquisite. Oh my God, when you hold it, it just comes alive. It almost puts me in an Italian salon, you know. There's one of the Triumph cards, the wheel. Oh, and probably the Emperor too. But just gorgeous. So, you know, I can't say this is my favorite Il Minigela deck because it's an incomplete deck. Can't do anything with it. It just kind of, I pull it out to show, you know. So I can't say for that reason that it's my favorite. But if they were to put this kind of quality into their, you know, a complete deck, I would probably go out of my mind with joy with it. Obviously, their Visconti Sorsa is definitely worth a mention, you know. And aside from it just being a lovely deck, you know, just by value or virtue of having survived from the 1440s, right, or the 1450s, and having a handful of cards to be able to create a deck from. We're only missing maybe 2 Triumph cards, you know, and that's incredible. So, however, okay, having said all that, I think my favorite Il Minigela deck, besides those, is probably the Tarocco Neoclassico. It's smaller, and I love it. Look at that death in a shroud. And we have the Hermit, like I love, with an hour. Is that an hourglass? No, excuse me. That's a lantern. I apologize, but I still love it. So it's an old deck, you know. It doesn't have a date. Oh, 1810 is the date for this deck. 1810. But I love the images of this deck. So I guess this is my favorite Il Minigela. Okay, now, favorite oh, and then there's my favorite by Fleur Noir. Okay, well, I picked 2 for Fleur Noir. I picked the Noble because it's small and I use it a lot, you know, especially when I do larger spreads. You know, I like the petite size, which is one of the reasons why I like the Rare Triumphs, right? It's a small size, right? So I like that. But plus I also love that it's a, you know, until we know better, it's the oldest style of Tarot of Marseille that we are aware of. But I don't know. I think the 22 cards from the Via Ville is my favorite of the Fleur Noir because I don't know, I just love it. He gives us 2 versions. He gives us the version that the Civilixi deck gives us, you know, the one by Patrick Coke, right? With the same like orientation of how the characters look. But he also gives us a corrected version that he feels would probably have been, you know, more accurately the way it was intended to be printed. But the colors are so incredibly beautiful. And there's clarity. You know, I can actually tell what I'm looking at. It's not, you know, now the Via Ville is not that hard. I mean, I have the Peterson, as I showed you, and I have the Civilixi. But when I study those, I pull this out too, because, you know, this helps me maybe understand what I'm not quite clicking in my head with in the other decks. So I think this is most definitely a beautiful deck by Noir. Favorite non-Franco-Italian historic deck, and I guess that would be the Vandenberg, because it's quirky. Again, Swiss. I think, it's interesting because when I was a guest on Masha's channel, Musings by Masha, she had asked me, what's your favorite deck? What are your favorite decks? And I can never come up with, don't ask me my favorite. I mean, I could be in a restaurant and take 30 minutes to decide on a thing from the menu, and, everybody hates me, because I can't decide what's a favorite, But I'm noticing that, like being forced to make commentary on these decks, I'm noticing a trend for myself that I really like the Swiss, or the Belgium, But I love this because it's fun. Again, it's got a border. I seem to like borders on decks. And it's got an interesting waxy back. This particular one does. This one was put out by Cartamundi, Turnout Belgium, and US Game Systems Inc. But it's got like a real satisfying feel to it in the back. The back is waxy and the front is paper. And of course it's got the Spanish captain in place of the female pope. And then it has Bacchus in place of the pope. I really like this deck a lot. Okay, let's see. Most expensive historic. I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of decks, and you collect cards for, if you collect tarot cards for 50 years or almost 47 or something like that, you're going to have a lot of out of print and first edition decks, So I imagine that some of those, just by virtue of being out of print and first edition decks that are almost 50 years old or 45 years old, those are probably worth a bit. I mean, I'm noticing, like the Fergus Hall deck that was put out alongside of Live and Let Die, the movie, right? That deck now is coming on its 50th anniversary, and I have a copy. But when you buy it, at the time, it's like, what are these? They're like Los Scarabeo or US Game Systems decks, so they're like $20, $15, But then you have them for 50 years, they're worth a couple bucks, So I'd have to really run down and like look at all like what the value is for certain decks, and I don't know. However, I know what I paid the most for. Speaking of Los Scarabeo, the deck that I've ever paid the most money for, and I believe unfortunately nowadays goes for like a fraction of what I paid, was the oh dear, where is it? Let me go on pause for a second and find it. This is the one that I've paid the most for, the Los Scarabeo Illuminating Ancient Tarots, which was the only version of the Solabusca that you can get before the wonderful artisans over at Berti and whoever else has created a beautiful copy of the Solabusca. There many beautiful houses have, tarot houses or publishers have created since the Solabusca, and glorious, But at the time when I bought this, it was the only game in town. And again, it was just one of these, Los Scarabeo decks put out in the 90s of the historic decks. Like I mentioned, the Visconti Sorsa tarots. They also put out this one, which at the time was the only copy of the Estensi Tarot you can get your hands on. So even though they're like, the small, cheesy kind of decks with 10 languages on them, they were the only game in town. So when I wanted the Solabusca, I wanted it, but by the time I wanted it, it was out of print. And so I had to pay through the nose for this deck, But now, since many other beautiful versions of this deck have been made by artisans like, Giordano Berti, I don't know who else, but I know the Game of Saturn, provided a beautiful deck, a copy of it. So now this, who's going to spend a few $100s on this deck when you can get one of those, right? So, it's fickle thing, what costs a lot now and what costs a lot in 2 years. I mean, I bought this maybe 7 years ago, 5 years ago, and already it's not even worth a fraction of what I paid for it. As far as valuable decks, I think of, value in terms of rarity. And I guess my most rare tarot deck would be the Tarocco Bolognese, Carte Fine El Mondo, created by Marco Benedetti. There are only 20 copies of this deck. There's only 20. So I'm guessing that this is my most rare tarot deck if there's only 20 copies. And I don't know what it would cost, but it's beautiful. It's very, very, very similar to the Fina della Torre, which I also have. I believe this one differs from the Fina della Torre in that it has the 4 Moors. So this one would have been, this Bolognese deck came in after 1725, whereas the Fina della Torre was like from the mid 1600s. So it still had the female pope, the empress, the emperor, and the pope. But I probably would never sell this deck. I love it. And it's got a petite size. And so, if I wanted to use it for, several cards spread, I can. But I don't know. I really don't know. I have some rare decks, out of print decks, first edition decks, many, many. And I just can't even begin to know what's more valuable than the other as far as that goes. But if you consider value in terms of rarity, that's probably it. I know my favorite deck of all time. Now they call this GOAT. I guess greatest of all tarot. So I don't know if that's from my perspective or from which is obviously I guess like the Estensi Tarot or Charles VI Tarot and the Visconti decks are priceless, because they give us a glimpse into the earliest decks that we know. There may have been earlier decks that but we could clearly classify as tarot, but until we find those are the two, right? And then we have the Rosenwald and the Budapest, which are really early. And so I cherish and value those early decks by virtue of just having survived in some form after all these years. But if I had to put a finger on maybe a deck that I really feel myself that I'm drawn to more and more, it's probably the Tarot of Paris. And I'm surprised to hear myself say that, because I would have thought it would have been an Italian deck. But the reason I think I like this a lot, and this one was put out by Civilixi. I'm not going to probably show you this because it's kind of confusing. I've always been drawn to it. I love the world card. I love the borders. And I've always been drawn to this, but I just could never always understand what I was looking at until the International Museum of Tarot put out a version whereby they cleaned up, and made, sense of what we were seeing. And I appreciated that very much because I really wanted to know what was going on in these cards. And I think the reason I really like it is because it seems to be a missing link. You know, we see reference to the fool holding, you know, the head of a fool on a stick, which is a reference to possibly a play put out in Italy in a Siena theater in the 1500s of two innkeepers who, you know, were vying for the main characters to stay in their hotel. And there's reference to a fool with a mirror. And it seems as, and I did a video about 7 minutes long a couple videos ago, so if you want to catch that, it's very interesting. So I think I kind of like the decks that are sort of missing link kind of decks that don't come from Italy, but they seem to have retained some of the Italian tradition, you know, whereas some of the existing tarot decks from Italy that we have, some of those samples are missing, right? I don't know that we have an Italian deck with a fool carrying a mirror or a stick with the mirror, with the fool on it. I'd have to go through all my decks to see if I have any, but as far as I know, I can't think of any. So I appreciate this deck, and it's just so beautiful, you know. Now, I don't care for the backs that they chose. I think it was a miss. You know, I don't like it. But since I don't look at the backs that often and I'm really only looking at the fronts, I love this deck. Is it the greatest deck of all time? I don't know. But I like it. I have a lot of decks. And I really like this one. And I kind of surprised myself to hear myself say that, because I've always been very partial, I think, to the Italian. And like I said, I kind of like, you know, the decks that sort of have the missing pieces of some Italian decks that the Italian decks don't have, you know, that we don't see because we can't find them. But we know there's written reference, you know, of cards that had Italian cards that had certain things. And we don't necessarily see them in the Italian decks that have survived. So anyway, those are, I think, the 10. I think those are the 10 questions. And I just added one question myself, you know, as far as Workhorse. I mean, you can love a deck and think it's beautiful. And, you know, I'm certainly not going to pull this deck out, you know, when I go to an event, or if I'm, you know, asked to do a reading in person, or if, you know, certainly if I'm doing a reading for, you know, one of my clients, it's not typically a deck that I'll pull out, you know. Because obviously, you know, when I do a lot of remote readings, that's typically my bread and butter. And so when you do remote readings, you know, you photograph them, right? So you want to be able to show clarity, right? My name is Tarot Clarity, right? So you want clarity. So my Workhorse decks have always been like the Spanish Tarot deck, which I pointed out earlier is one of the earliest, you know, pit style cards, you know, I could get my hands on. Right? They're made to be shuffled. I've shuffled this deck thousands of times and you'd never know it. The classic tarot had been a Workhorse deck, but it's getting old and frail. It's hit the 50-year mark almost, you know, so I'm not using it as a Workhorse deck. And then the other new decks that I'm using as Workhorse decks are the decks put out by Artisan Tarot. The Noble, which you can get. It's available now at Kickstarter. You can definitely get in on this, which is, you know, I was, you know, fortunate enough to be given an advanced copy of both this deck and their Conver. This one has been delivered, and I think you can still get it. But these decks, I really like these decks for, you know, Workhorse decks because, you know, linen cardstock. You can definitely shuffle these cards. And the Noble, I think, is going to become my absolute, you know, favorite Workhorse because it's so tiny. It's a bridge size. It's a bridge size deck, right? So, it's definitely, it's already becoming the one I put in my handbag. You know, is my Workhorse deck. So I think that's it. I don't know how interesting it was. I hope it was interesting to some of you guys. And it was interesting for me because I finally now learned that I have a thing for like the Belgian and Swiss tarot decks that I wouldn't have suspected. I think I did suspect it a little bit, but yeah. At any rate, until next time, friends, peace and stay well.